The following intervention is going to be related to the food situation in Natal during COVID-19 with this increase of agricultural product and also something that we saw in France, notably this appetite for local produce and agroecology. Those are issues that are very cross-cutting, that cut across a lot of different themes. So thank you for your patience, and I'd like to apologize. In fact, we are a group of university professors. We come from different disciplines, and in fact, we're going to present here a preliminary uh, reflection on what we have seen in Natal, and we're going to talk about a solidarity campaign we've organized during the pandemic. The crisis, its social impact, we have seen a number of problems in access to food. And we have shown the importance of the rapprochement between the countryside and the city. Very early, urgent requests were made by vulnerable groups and farmers who could not sell their production anymore. Civil society decided to mobilize in order to reduce the effects of the crisis. A number of campaigns, a number of women have started doing solidarity. We will look at the role played by women in the exchange through our example related to the Feria Solidaria. We're not going to be able to present the whole thing because we're still in a difficult context, we're still confined, but we're going to present data that can be used later on. That will also give the opportunity of raising gender issues without going into the details. We need to be able to perceive the different ways of consuming and eating in Natal, to understand that family life oftentimes is based on a solidarity that is organized at the level of working class neighborhoods, perceived as an extension of the domestic space. So this is the overall context of the food issue in Brazil. We will then describe the support action called La Feira Solidaria that has benefited farmers and families. We will take the example of a religious center to show you how this solidarity was organized. So here, the report on food security and nutrition in the world, published in July 2020 by FAO, and another report on family purchasing power, published in September, have given us figures to understand, to have a better understanding of the very alarming food situation in that area. We realize that over a 5-year period, we've seen an increase of 3 million people not having a normal access to healthy food. You see that half of the households in this area have received emergency help, as you can see. Next slide. So that represents more than 10 million Brazilians, the 4.6% of the population that finds itself in a situation of serious food insecurity. The situation is even more critical for a single parent family headed by women because almost 52% of families in serious food insecurity are headed by women. The pandemic is aggravating the situation in cities, increasing social, racial, and gender inequalities in a country that has been going through a political crisis. The impact of the pandemic have important impact. Next slide. For the state of the Rio Grande do Norte, 400,000 families have contacted emergency help, and in Natal, where you have 800,000 people, 57% of families benefit from those benefits. 65% of them in a situation of extreme poverty or Black or of mixed race. So Black women are the most vulnerable. They receive, on average, half of what the white men receive, and they are twice as much hit by unemployment rate. In those areas, those people have a very precarious jobs, and they have dual days, triple days, because they have to feed children of different marriages, grandchildren, their parents, and they have to work to feed their family. Overnight, those families who were already living in precarious situations found themselves with no resource at all. Next slide. The food situation around the cities deteriorated with the pandemic in the countryside and in the cities because of the fact that a school stopped feeding the children, and there was also no support. Social inequality have increased, especially for those mothers who have had to dedicate more time to their children, who were no longer going to school and having to take care of their parents. So the right to food became a societal problem impacting women in particular. Women in those poor areas are head of the household. They get the support of the Bolsa Familia, that is a family allowance program implemented in 2003. On top of that, emergency help was implemented by the government in 2020, and that has given priority to those families and informal workers. Depending on the regions, informal work can represent up to 40%, 40 to 50% of the active population. For our example of the Fera Solidaria, it was born in this context of food crisis. The producers of 4 agricultural settlements no longer were able to sell their production, and they were given help. Between May and June 2020, 4 campaigns were organized. 15 tons of fruits and vegetables were distributed to 2,000 families in situation of social vulnerability. They were part of cultural associations, churches, localized around the city. Next slide. The fourth edition, 700 baskets were distributed to these poor population. We have more women involved in the activities, i.e. Feeding, caring, taking care of the family. In the public sphere, they are more working into the area of social justice. So these campaigns organized on the social media through WhatsApp and Instagram were implemented. Here you see the Natal map with the neighborhoods that have benefited and the producers in blue, and the yellow point is the example we're going to develop later on. We can move to the next slide. A number of other projects exist that aim at bringing together producers and consumers. that existed even before the pandemic. The landless movement, MST, is very much located in the area. They benefit from the support of the Rio Grande do Norte state. It is our state is headed by the only woman in that position in Brazil. She's implemented support measures for small farmers. Her policies are being deployed at the moment, and she has organized distribution of 60 tons of food produced by agricultural cooperatives. During the crisis, we have had an increase in the number of contacts between producers and consumers. For middle classes, women are more interested in taking food from sustainable agricultural. We can now move to the following slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. During the fourth edition of the Fera Solidaria, 107 people have contributed, 50% are women. The beneficiaries of the 85 baskets received, 68% are also female beneficiaries. So, in all cases, regarding production, distribution, and reception of the food, women are in the front line. Next slide. I'm almost finished. One specific example of solidarity. Here we have on the screen a view of the city. In the background, you see the downtown area. In the front, you see a poor neighborhood, Zona Norte, where our religious center is located. The faithful in this religious center that was closed during the pandemic and inhabitants of poor neighborhoods, 1,800 families were the first beneficiaries of this Fera Solidaria in May 2020. The religious center is a neighborhood where 100,000 people live. This is an area where people only sleep because they work in Natal across the river and in the service. So it's also an area that was built where there's a lot of violence, illegal occupation of land, a lot of insecurity problems. It's a very sensitive area. And based on a survey carried out in 2018 by Maria Rita, 90% of the families benefit from that public support. 18% of children do not go to school, and more than 80% of households are headed by women. We haven't explored that aspect, but it often happens in Brazil that households are headed by women. Historically, the terreiros benefit were built in areas not very little developed, and they are for people from poor categories of the society. They, the centers play an important part in the distribution of food, since the cults, the worships are organized around offerings and meals for the gods. The meals are then, of course, eaten by a participant. It's a place of worship, but it's also a cultural place where you can follow courses, self-help, mutual aid, especially for women. Here, you have a lot of solidarity between people, regardless of their religion. Maria Rita would like to be part of the town hall, the municipal council, so that marks the entrance of women in public life outside of the kitchens, but always in the area of family welfare. By way of conclusion, I think it is not the right side. It is the commitment of women from different social backgrounds that has made it possible to create a link between producers and families, between the countryside and the city, thanks to volunteers. At the beginning, before the pandemic, those small producers used to sell to middle classes, and local policies are going to replace statewide policies that have been stopped. Finally, and this will be my last slide, without those social actions where women seem to be the main actors and beneficiaries, the crisis was lessened. Nevertheless, the food crisis in other areas remains critical, and short-term prospects are such that half of the population is exposed to food risk in the very short future. Sorry for the changes and the technical issues. I didn't really understand what time I was supposed to make my presentation. I think you've changed your time. I made a mistake. Yes, I think that we have a one last image. Here you have the different institutions that were involved.